Dominee Botha. Dames en heren, die eerste minister sal self in sy hoofrede die hoofdoel van hierdie bijeenkomst uiteensit. Ek wil net heel aan die begin die vanselfsprekende punt maak dat hierdie beraad in die eerste plek 'n sakeleiers-beraad is. This is a business leaders conference and our main business today is business, not politics. Of course, it would be utterly naive to think that the sharp dividing line could be drawn between economics and politics. Be prepared to comment briefly on important issues raised during the conference, if in their judgment, this is the time and the place to do so.
Mr. Chairman, these conditions have deteriorated further. Political turbulence and violence continue to reign in Africa. The number of refugees has increased from 750,000 in 1970 to almost 5 million in 1980. Economic retrogression and decline are the order of the day. It is estimated that the foreign debts of the non-oil producing African countries rose sharply to about $43 billion in 1980. Food has become a luxury, and it is estimated that in 1980 Africa's food and agricultural output increased by only 2%, as against a population growth of almost 3%. Production per head of population has therefore shown a decline for the second successive year. The available facts indicate that 150 million people in 26 sub-Saharan countries are faced with famine or serious food shortages. In a recent report of the United Nations, number A36513, these conditions were described as follows. I quote, "As the world enters into the third decade of global development strategies, Africa remains by any standard the least developed of the developing regions. It has 21 of the 31 least developed countries, and several other countries are close to that margin. It has the lowest gross domestic product and the lowest net capital formation. Although the African region suffers from endemic diseases of the cruelest type, it has the fewest doctors and fewest hospital beds. The infant mortality rate is high and life expectancy is low. Africa has the lowest rate of literacy, or from another viewpoint, the highest rate of illiteracy. The greater number of African countries are unable to feed their population. Where surpluses of any given commodity are to be found, it is a formidable problem to get them to where they are needed because the transport linkage are weak. Africa has the greatest number of refugees and a large population of disabled persons. Unemployment in urban areas has reached unacceptable levels. All of this and more has brought and continues to bring untold sorrow and misery to large segments of the population." Unquote. Political instability and economic decline naturally create a fertile breeding ground for revolution and communist encroachment, a situation which is exploited and promoted by the Marxist world. On top of this, the Soviet Union is showing an increasing willingness, while in its view, the arms race is still going in its favor, to become directly militarily involved in the struggle for world domination. Proof of this we have seen in Afghanistan, and we ourselves have found in Angola recently. The dispensation that communism creates leaves no room for liberty and proper development. I need hardly remind you of the effects of economic stagnation in communist systems. South Africa finds nothing to gloat about in these circumstances. South Africa House is, however, today better equipped in many respects than 2 years ago to resist these external forces and to extend the hand of cooperation in order to help others to help themselves. Our position has become considerably stronger as regards not only the economy, technology, and energy supply, but also our military preparedness. Our relations with the United States of America and some other countries are also characterized by greater realism. Thanks to our agricultural industry, the Republic of South Africa is also one of the most important producers of food in the world, and the most important one in Africa. So far as Southwest Africa is concerned, a fresh attempt is being made to find satisfactory solution with recognition of the role to be played by the internal parties. This is not to say that we are out of the woods. Negotiations in store for the parties involved in these matters. That I want to mention is the fact that 2 years ago I did not have a personal mandate from the country to go ahead with the implementation of the policy which the government regarded as essential to ensure a better future for the various population groups of our country and to maintain stability. Since then, I have obtained an overwhelming mandate from the electorate, which has given me a 2/3 majority in Parliament, and I want to make it clear to you that I will not shrink from carrying out my duty, as I and my colleagues see it, in the interests of the country. But I cannot answer for the distorted pictures of government policy which raise false expectations. If we differ, let us differ on the merits of matters. But let us cooperate in those matters on which we really agree. In this way, a better understanding will also evolve in due course concerning those things about which we do not now agree. In deciding to convene this second conference, it was in fact the Cabinet's intention to create an opportunity for further consultation and rethinking. After all, over the past 2 years we have all gained more experience, and it will decidedly be to everyone's advantage for us to share that experience and the knowledge we have gained. In the process of rethinking, it is necessary in the first place to clear up misunderstandings that have possibly arisen in connection with the previous conference. In the process of constitutional reform is clearly one of the matters about which a misunderstanding has arisen in certain circles. However, I think it is correct to say that there was agreement at the previous conference that orderly government and stability are prerequisites for economic development, and that the maintenance of orderly government in South Africa calls for constitutional reform. I am also under the impression that there was agreement as to the direction in which we should be moving with such a process of constitutional reform, namely, to make it possible for all in South Africa to participate effectively, individually and within the processes affecting their lives and expectations. That is the aim. On exactly how this is to be achieved, the political parties in this country differ. And I assume that there was or is not agreement among those who participated in the Carlton Conference on the way in which an effective political voice for all should be sought. To clear up any possible misunderstanding, I want to stress again that the government's standpoint still is that this aim should be pursued by creating structures through which every nation and population group will enjoy self-determination as regards its own interests and co-responsibility for common interests. Of course, I realize that self-determination is a relative and not an absolute term. The government is not, therefore, steering towards a unitary state with a unitary society for all in South Africa. However, it does realize the necessity of continuing consultation and negotiation as the only way in which constitutional development can be carried through. So far as the Republic of South Africa itself is concerned, this consultation and negotiation is taking place with many leaders of self-governing and independent states and with community leaders in the Republic of South Africa. As regards the independent states and those that are on the threshold of independence, the government has already announced its firm intention and taken steps to enter into negotiations with them on the creation of a confederation of states. It is by no means the aim to make those states subordinate to the Republic of South Africa, but to create interstatal structures for orderly cooperation in respect of our many common interests in the economic, social, technological, and security spheres. However, constitutional reform is and continues to be a difficult and often thankless task. Accusations such as too much too soon or too little too late are often heard, perhaps precisely because the necessary understanding of the complexity and sensitivity of the task of reform is lacking. It is necessary to take account of the fact that this is a continuing, growing process that cannot be accomplished unilaterally and overnight. It is also necessary to take account of the rich variety of minority groups in Southern Africa, each with its own aspirations, a fact that must also be taken into account in designing constitutional models. Not to seek justification for discriminatory practices, but because the constitutional accommodation of minority groups is a problem that is being grappled with all over the world. Those who ignore the fact that we are an African state and who dictate stereotyped constitutional formulae deriving from Western Europe and North America for Southern African problems are not making any contribution. I ask no more of you than to accept that the government is serious in its endeavor to secure effective political participation for all, while maintaining sufficient stability to make possible, among other things, healthy economic development and safeguarding the principle of effective decision-making for South Africa. One field which has been the subject of particularly lively debate lately, and in which the separate potential contributions of the sector ought to be spelled out clearly, is that of housing for the lower income groups. In this connection, the government, some months ago already, took the initiative in forming a joint private sector, public sector committee under the chairmanship of Mr. Botha, the former chairman of the Association of Building Societies, with the specific task of inquiring into and making recommendations on ways of achieving maximum involvement of the private sector in solving black housing problems in South Africa. The Viljoen Committee submitted its report to the government, and in their essentials, the principles contained in the report have been accepted by the government. Among these principles are the following. Firstly, owing to the fact that the state lacks the financial means to carry the full burden of housing, the private sector and the individual will have to play a far more active part in the planning, erection, and the financing of low-cost housing. With a view to formulating the financing involvement of the private sector and the state, the government has decided that this task should be tackled immediately by a finance committee under the chairmanship of the Deputy Minister of Finance, Mr. State. Secondly, the government has already applied to the private sector's participation in black township development. These steps include, firstly, the involvement in undertaking the planning. Secondly, legislation that has already been passed to enable employers and developers to obtain leasehold in their own right in black urban areas. And thirdly, greater encouragement of self-building schemes in these areas so as to involve individual homeowners directly in the provision. I'm convinced that if we implement this approach positively, but always subject to specific norms and standards of housing, it will be possible to meet the present housing problem in an orderly way and within the country's means. This is an essential condition for a happy and contented labour force. At the Carlton Conference, ladies and gentlemen, 2 years ago, I also envisaged certain institutional reforms that would make for a more balanced geographic distribution of economic activity in South Africa and a more acceptable apportionment of opportunities for participation in the country's economic system. Meanwhile, the Small Businesses Development Corporation has taken shape as a direct outcome of the Carlton Conference. And during the past session of Parliament, legislation was passed to authorize the state's participation in this unique example of cooperation between the government and the private sector. As you know, the corporation has already started its activities. The Small Businesses Advisory Council, which will function parallel to the Small Business Development Corporation to promote training and follow-up activities in respect of small businesses, has also started its work already. The Multilateral Development Bank, which I also envisaged 2 years ago as performing so far as practicable the functions at present handled by inter alia various institutions of the South African government, has needed more time to take shape than was originally expected. There have been various reasons for this. Firstly, this is an altogether new field that we are entering, namely an international non-political development bank. And rather than set about things over hastily, we must first complete the preparatory step. In the situation in which South Africa finds itself today, greater demands are in any event being made on all parties than would have been the case in normal times of peace. In endeavoring to build up a strong economy, account must also be taken of the security situation in particular, and of the necessary developments that have to be carried through in the constitutional and social spheres. In the security sphere, there is one matter on which all of us here today are surely agreed, and that is that Southern Africa is a primary target of Soviet imperialism. Differ as we may on the question whether this or that party's policy is the best counter to Soviet expansionism, on one matter we dare not differ. The Soviet Union will not abandon its declared objective in Southern Africa if the present government is replaced by another democratically instituted government. In point of fact, it is the Soviet Union's aim to destroy the norms and value systems of the free world and the system of free enterprise. Its strategy is elementary: undermine the socio-political stability and paralyze the economy in order to sap the military capability. Recently, General Haig, the American Secretary of State, rightly declared as follows: I have often mentioned the activities of the Soviet Union and its proxy in aggravating tensions from Central America to Southern Africa. Can there be a greater contrast between their efforts and those of the West in trying to resolve the political, economic, and security problems of these regions? It is time for those who preach peace to contribute to peace. So far, General Haig. What the communists are concerned with is not the interests of the black and brown people in Southern Africa, how to undermine the stability and the prosperity of the subcontinent. Every government in Southern Africa that is not willing to serve Soviet interests is a target of Soviet strategy. Governments in Southern Africa will therefore have to decide what is of greater importance to them: the development of their people and the maintenance of socio-political stability, or the fomenting of ideological differences to flashpoint. Soviet strategy is aimed particularly at activating various fronts on the borders of the Republic of South Africa, so as to involve security forces outside the metropolitan areas, thus leaving these areas vulnerable to urban terrorism. The military threat against the Republic of South Africa consists in the build-up of Soviet-oriented armed forces and equipment in some of our neighboring states. There is also a presence of Soviet and surrogate forces in the form of military specialists, advisors, and technicians in some of these countries. The South African government has time and again stressed its willingness to sign non-aggression pacts with neighboring countries, as well as treaties that will prevent states in Southern Africa from making their territory available for use as basis for hostile action against one another. Nevertheless, attempts are being made from outside to create and to promote a revolutionary climate within the Republic of South Africa itself. The main objective is to incite urban terrorism in the metropolitan areas with the use of front organizations. The efforts may also be expected to intensify as the innovative development brought about by the state begins to bear fruit. The government is therefore determined to maintain the Republic of South Africa's military preparedness, to ward off any excursions against our borders, and to preserve internal order. At the same time, we will continue to make progress with essential reforms in the economic, constitutional, and social spheres. However, there is one important consideration that must be taken into account in trying to undertake a process of reform among well-considered lines. Instability is bound to follow if reforms are tackled which do not allow for balance between spheres of interest. The raising of the level of political participation alone, or the average level of prosperity alone, or the level of education alone, or in respect of specific groups alone, cannot be conducive to stability. Political reform must be coordinated with progress and development in the spheres of spiritual and social welfare as well as material welfare. This calls for teamwork. Your positive contribution is indispensable. Against this background, it was gratifying for the government to learn of the private sector's enthusiasm, especially since the Carlton Conference, for playing a more active role in helping to solve the development problems in Southern Africa. The object of this conference is not, however, merely to convey the government's point of view to you. On the contrary, ladies and gentlemen, cooperation means mutual consultation on matters of common concern. I therefore want to invite you to air your views on any matter that has a bearing on the purpose of this conference. My cabinet colleagues and the heads of the various departments will reply as far as possible to any questions you may have on your minds. During the past 2 years, reference has often been made to the Carlton Conference. I hope that in the future our deliberation here in the Cape of Good Hope will be referred to as the Good Hope Conference, from which new hope will spring for all the people of Southern Africa, as well as for the free world. I thank you.